Let's study 10th standard ICSE Biology Chapter 10, the nervous system. No, this chapter is not that difficult, so there's no need to get nervous. The basic unit of the nervous system is the neuron or the nerve cell. Let's understand the structure of the neuron. This figure is very important. The three main parts of a neuron is the cyton, also called perikaryon, which is the cell body. The various branches called dendrons, which have sub-branches called dendrites. And a very long process called the axon. The cyton has a nucleus and it has some granules called Nissl granules. The axon has many coverings on it. The first covering is the myelin sheath, which is an insulating layer, and it's white in color. There may be an extra protective sheath called the neurolemma, which is absent in the central nervous system. Now this myelin sheath has many gaps in between called node of Ranvier, and the axons may have some lateral or side branches as well. The terminal of the axon is called the axon terminal. Now it is this axon terminal which forms a synaptic junction with the next neuron. Understand that the cell body has no centrioles. That means neurons have lost the ability to divide further. Every day you are losing neurons in your brain which are not being degenerated. That's okay, you have billions and billions of them in your brain, hopefully. Only once you cross a very old age will you start feeling the effects of losing these neurons. There are some exercises to slow down the death of the axons. And I have recently discovered a very easy exercise to prevent the degeneration of your brain and to have a sharp mind even through old age. The exercise is to study science regularly for a couple of hours and do all my homework well. Now the neurons are of three types. The sensory neuron, as the name suggests, will carry impulses from the receptor, which are there in the senses, like your skin. This is the direction of conduction of the impulse. And you can see that the axon terminal is in close connection with the dendrites of the next neuron. And such a close connection between the axon of one neuron and the dendrite of the next neuron is called a synapse. That's a junction where the electrical impulse jumps to the other neuron. And this time, this one is called the association neuron because it will now associate it with the next neuron called the motor neuron. The motor neuron will carry the impulse to the effector, that is either a muscle or a gland, and then you will respond to this stimulus. So that is the entire reflex arc out here. But there are many parts missing, so the perfect diagram will be shown later. So let's call this just the journey of a nerve impulse. But how does an impulse actually carry? It's not like electricity. Through a wire, electrons flow, but not here. It's flowing electrochemically. So what happens is that the nerve fiber which is made up of many axons, is usually in the polarized state. That is the resting region, where the sodium ions are outside and the inner part is negative. Whenever there is a stimulus, there is an excitation, there is any sudden change in the external or internal environment, then that part of the nerve fiber will get excited or depolarized. The sodium ions will move in. That's because this membrane becomes more permeable to the sodium ions. So that's a chain reaction, a chemical chain reaction set up by the stimulus. Now this excited region is a stimulus for the next part of the nerve fiber. So now they will get depolarized and the earlier part will get repolarized. They will be recovered. The sodium ions will go back to their usual position. So a wave of impulse is set forth where we have depolarization and repolarization moving forward, and that is how an impulse travels. And this transportation of a sodium happens because of something called sodium pump and requires ATP energy. And finally, this will result in some kind of response to the stimulus. The stimulus is received by the receptor and the action is taken by the effector, which is either a muscle or a gland. Now, just like we have three kinds of neurons, we have three types of nerves as well. Nerves, as I said, are just a bundle of axons together, and even they are surrounded by a tubular sheath, a myelin sheath for insulation to prevent the mixing up of the impulses. We don't want a short circuit or a cross connection in a body. The nerves are also of three types. Sensory nerves carry impulses from the sensory receptors to the CNS, central nervous system, which is either the brain or spinal cord. For example, the optic nerve, which arises from the eye and ending in the brain. It carries all the information from the eye and helps us to see. Motor nerves carry motor fibers carrying impulses from the brain or spinal cord, that is the CNS, to the effectors, which is either a muscle or a gland. Example of that is the nerve arising from the brain and supplying the muscles of the eyeball for the rotation of the eye. And third, we have mixed nerves, which have both sensory and motor fibers. Example, spinal nerves. All spinal nerves are mixed nerves because they have sensory as well as motor neurons. We'll study the diagram of mixed nerves in a while. Now, just like an axon, a collection of axon is called a nerve fiber. Similarly, a collection of cytons or cell bodies is called a ganglion, plural ganglia. Now that we know the basic unit of the nervous system, let's study its types and parts. The nervous system can be divided or classified into the central nervous system, which has the brain and spinal cord, of course, and the peripheral nervous system, the PNS. The peripheral nervous system looks something like this. It's extending to all parts of the body. And no, they are not seen through the skin. What you see through your skin, just under the skin, are actually blood vessels. They're not nerves. Now, the peripheral nervous system can be of two types, somatic and autonomic. Somatic is under our control. It controls all our voluntary actions, which can either be through the cranial nerves, there are 12 pairs arising from the brain, or there can be spinal nerves. There are 31 pairs arising from the spinal cord. They can even control our reflex actions, which are involuntary. And then we have the autonomic nervous system, the ANS. They are completely out of our control. They are a pair of chains of ganglia close to or embedded in the organs. Now, they can either be sympathetic or parasympathetic. The sympathetic nervous system comprises of nerves between the neck and the waist, and they are stimulatory by nature. They prepare us for fight or flight. They work in close coordination with adrenaline hormone. They accelerate heartbeat, dilate our pupils of the eye, constrict the blood vessels near the skin, and release sugar from liver for extra energy because perhaps we are in a crisis. The parasympathetic nervous system, which is located in the form of nerves above the neck and below the sacrum, which is near the hip. It has a calming effect. It helps in restoring the normal body condition. After the crisis is over, we can't have an accelerated heartbeat for a whole life. It needs to get back to normal, and this normalcy is brought about by the parasympathetic nervous system. So both of them work opposite to each other, and both of them are autonomic. That is, we have no control over it. Now let's understand the central nervous system in detail. First, let's start with the brain. The human brain is extremely complex. It's one of the most complex things in the universe. We have still not unraveled all the mysteries behind its working. Although your brain should be quite simple to understand it because it has very simple commands like get up, eat, sleep, laze about, and do a little bit of homework. It's double tick. You have to draw this. Yes. And the size of your diagram should correspond to the actual size of your brain. Now, it has many parts. The labeling is more important. The most important part of the brain is the medulla oblongata. If that is injured, then death is certain because it controls all the involuntary actions of our internal organs, heartbeat, breathing, etc. Even when we are asleep, it is active and it controls these activities. And below it, the spinal cord starts. The largest part of the brain is the cerebrum, which is divided into two hemispheres, the left and the right hemisphere. Here they've shown the left hemisphere, cerebral hemisphere. The left and the right hemisphere are connected with the help of some fibers called corpus callosum. It helps us to coordinate between the left side of the body and the right side of the body. If this is damaged, then coordination will be different, will be difficult. Imagine if your left hand rebels against you and doesn't listen to you anymore and does whatever it wants to do, and only the right hand listens to you. Now, there is another part of the brain called the cerebellum. On one hand, the cerebrum, the largest part, it is the seat of intelligence, memory, thinking, consciousness, the senses like sight, that is vision, hearing, taste, etc. Or any decision for any voluntary action occurs here. The cerebellum, on the other hand, is responsible for the coordination and balancing of our body. You see, if you wish to lift this pencil, the thought originated in the cerebrum, but it was executed by the cerebellum. The cerebellum helps us to coordinate between our eyes and our muscles and maintain the balance of the entire body without tripping over. That's why if you drink a lot of alcohol, and the cerebellum will shut then, and you won't be able to balance at all, which is quite dangerous. At the roof of the midbrain, we see that there is a hypothalamus, and below that we have the pituitary gland, the master endocrine gland. There is a swollen part of the brain as well called the pons. So that's a part of the hind brain, and its function is to connect the two hemispheres of the cerebellum, just like corpus callosum connects and sends impulses from the left cerebral hemisphere to the right cerebral hemisphere. Similarly, the pons does the same work for the cerebellum. Now notice how the brain is protected by various layers or meninges like pia mater, dura mater and arachnoid. Remember, the dura mater is the outermost tough fibrous membrane. The second membrane or the middle membrane is arachnoid, which has many web-like cushions, and the innermost is the pia mater. And of course we have the skull on top of it, and maybe some hair as well. Now, the spaces between these meninges is covered by a cerebrospinal fluid. In fact, that fluid fills all the hollows inside the brain and even inside the hollow of the vertebral column. So it's called cerebrospinal fluid. It acts like a cushion to protect the brain from shocks. Now, if you look at a brain, you will notice that it is grey from outside. Actually, it will look pinkish because of blood, but apart from that, it is greyish on the outside, and if you dig deeper, it's white on the inside. That's because it has cytons on the outside, the cell bodies, which are grey in color, and it has axons on the inside, and axons are white because they have this myelin sheath. The spinal cord is the reverse of this. On the outside, it is white because here the axons are on the outside, and deep inside, you will see that it is grey because the cytons or the cell bodies of the neurons are inside in the center of the spinal cord. Now, there's another way to classify the brain. There are three primary regions. The forebrain, which has the cerebrum and the diencephalon. The diencephalon has the thalamus and the hypothalamus. We saw the hypothalamus just above the pituitary gland. Thalamus has a function that is, it relays pain and pressure impulses to cerebrum. Imagine if your thalamus is destroyed, then you won't ever feel pain, which is bad because your pant may be on fire and you won't even realize it. Hypothalamus, it's important because it controls the temperature of the body, and also it controls the pituitary, which is the master gland. The midbrain is a very small tubular part, and it just controls the reflexes involving eyes and ears. The hindbrain, on the other hand, has cerebellum. We've studied that. Pons, as I've said, and of course medulla oblongata. Now the spinal cord, as I said, has cerebrospinal fluid, and it has 31 nerves. And the function of the spinal cord is, first of all, it takes care of all the reflexes below the neck. Yeah, above the neck, that is on your face, the reflexes are controlled by your brain, by the way, because that is the nearby headquarters. It also conducts sensory impulses from the skin and muscles to the brain, and it conducts motor responses from the brain to the muscles of the trunk, that is the chest and the abdomen and the limbs. Next, the peripheral nervous system. First type of that is somatic nervous system, which takes care of all the voluntary actions and of course reflex actions. There are 12 pairs of cranial nerves starting from the cranium, which is the skull box, brain box. It may be sensory nerves like the olfactory for nose, optic for eyes and auditory for ears. and gustatory for tongue. It may have some motor nerves, for example, the ones going to the eye muscles for eye rotation, or it may have mixed nerves, that is having sensory and motor fibers both. For example, the nerve going to and coming from the face and the tongue. Spinal nerves, on the other hand, are always mixed, all of them, all 31 of them. 8 are in the neck region, the cervical region, so that corresponds to a backbones also. 12 are in the thorax or the chest region, 5 in the lumbar or lower back, and 5 in the sacral or hip region, and just 1 in the coccygeal region, which is the last part of a backbone or the tailbone. Now, the autonomic nervous system is totally out of our control, and that is regulated by hypothalamus and medulla oblongata. They control the involuntary actions of the internal organs, which can be either sympathetic or parasympathetic. You can see the various actions taken by the autonomic nervous system. You may study that with the help of this table, which is similar to the one in the chapter endocrine system for adrenaline, because when you are in a crisis or you're excited, then the sympathetic system kicks in. It will accelerate your heartbeat, constrict your blood vessels so that your skin becomes pale, and even your digestive system will stop or pause temporarily, because in the time of crisis, it's not important that you digest food, it's more important that you don't get digested by a carnivore. Of course, the parasympathetic nervous system will do the exact opposite of it once normalcy has to be retained. Notice how the sympathetic nervous system will cause dryness of the mouth, because the digestive system capillaries or arterioles have constricted, so even saliva secretion is inhibited. That's why whenever you start giving my exam, you feel thirsty because your mouth becomes dry out of nervousness. Now let's talk about reflexes, which are somatic reflexes controlled by the somatic nervous system, which is partially in our control, and the autonomic reflexes, which are totally out of our control. A stimulus can be physical, chemical, radiant, thermal, or electrical, which may cause a reflex action. You see, what happens is, as soon as the sensory nerve sends an information to the spinal cord, instead of allowing the brain to decide what to do, which will take time, a decision is already made and the muscle will contract, pulling your finger away from the hot object. And it's only after the reflex has happened, then you realize what has just happened, because the email is CC'd to the brain as well. That is, the impulse is sent to the brain as well to let it know what just happened. So that's an example of a reflex action, and a beautiful diagram of the reflex arc, a simple reflex arc is shown here. It starts with the receptor, goes through the sensory neuron, which has a dorsal ganglion, and the association neuron obviously connects the sensory neuron to the motor neuron here, and that message ultimately reaches the effector, that is a muscle or the gland. And this is just one nerve of the spinal cord. That's why it's called a mixed nerve, because it has a sensory neuron as well as the motor neuron. See how the white matter is outside and the gray matter is in the center. There is a hollow in the center here, which is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Other examples of reflex action are flushing of tears, that is, you start crying when a particle gets inside. That's autonomic, by the way. Instantaneous withdrawal of hand, we just studied, that's somatic, because we are using the same nerves which we use for voluntary actions. Shivering when it's too cold, or sweating, they are autonomic. Dilation of the eye pupil is also autonomic. Learn the difference between an involuntary action and a voluntary action. Now this is the same diagram of a nervous pathway in detail. Now remember that peristalsis or beating of the heart are all autonomic reflex actions. They are not the usual reflex actions which we say as somatic reflex actions. Reflexes can also be inborn or acquired, that is conditioned. For example, blinking, coughing, sneezing, we are born with these reflexes. Even babies start doing this, so they're autonomic. Whereas, by the way, blinking is somatic because we are using the same nerves which we use for voluntary blinking. Even salivation, swallowing, etc. are inborn. And what is a conditioned reflex? Well, let me give an example. If you are well trained in driving a vehicle, as soon as you see a red signal, automatically you apply brakes, but you don't even think about it, because you've conditioned your brain about it. When you were driving a cycle or a vehicle for the very first time, you wouldn't be able to be very quick in applying the brakes. Often you would crash into the obstacle ahead because you hadn't yet acquired that reflex. A very nice experiment will explain this in detail. It is called the Pavlov's experiment. A dog was given food at regular intervals and a bell was also rung at the same time. After a few weeks, when only the bell was rung and no food was provided, yet the dog would start salivating because the brain had associated the ringing of the bell with the availability of food. So it started salivating, anticipating a food. This is a perfect example of a conditioned reflex, an acquired reflex, which is learned by experience. Some other natural reflexes are knee jerk, which doctors often use to check your reflex. Even the closing of the eyelids and withdrawal of the hand. Conditioned reflexes examples would be applying brakes or playing a musical instrument without even looking at it, like the guitar once you're a pro, or tying your shoelace without even looking at it. When you were a kid, you used to sing songs like Over the Mountain, Into the Valley while tying the knot. But now you don't have to do that. In natural reflexes, remember that coughing and sneezing are autonomic, whereas knee-jerk and withdrawal of hand and closing of eyelids are somatic. But they are natural reflexes nevertheless. Reflexes can also be simple as well as complex. A simple reflex is the one in which the impulse through the sensory neuron and the impulse through the motor neuron are at the same level. But what if they are at different levels or different heights? For example, in the dark, if you step on some rope, your entire body does a reflex action. You may scream, you may jump with your legs, your hands may move. So all these reflexes are happening together at multiple levels in the spinal cord and the brain. So that's why we can call it a complex reflex. Now, this is a reflex arc. We've studied the diagram. We need to know this part because in exam they can jumble it up and ask us to rearrange it. Now, remember one point. Heartbeat is an autonomic reflex. But when we just say reflexes, reflex action, we are actually talking about somatic reflexes, not such autonomic reflexes.
Hi students, this is AJ sir. If you like this video, press the like button. If you would like to enroll for my online test series or online lectures, email me or message me on Instagram. Check the description for more information.